Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talks is part of the Love Your Library event series and is an initiative of the FIT Library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. From photography to fashion illustration, fiction writing to art, these talks encompass a multitude of projects and themes that celebrate creativity. So, before I introduce our guest, I'd like to invite you to enter questions in the chat as we go along. But we're going to be holding questions until the end of the presentation. Whatever you put in the chat, I will present them to Natalie. And without further ado, let's introduce our speaker. Today, our FIT author is Natalie Nudell, who has been teaching at FIT in the History of Art department since 2017. She is going to be discussing her open source digital humanities project and historical archive called In American Fashion, Ruth Finley's Fashion Calendar. In American Fashion is the first scholarly analysis of the fashion calendar, the unique scheduling service and trade publication for the American fashion and creative industries that was published between 1941 and 2014. Published by Ruth Finley for almost 7 decades, the calendar had an extensive impact on the development of the American fashion industry in the 20th century. Unlike European fashion capitals, the American fashion industry relied on an independent small publisher to manage the schedule of an ever growing industry. In American Fashion shows how this independent position influenced the democratic approach reflected in the industry in the United States. So thank you, Natalie, for joining us today, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to learn about In American Fashion. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jennifer Brady and the FIT Library for inviting me to present In American Fashion, as well as Samantha Levin for moderating this talk. I'm very grateful for the support of my research and scholarship, and what a better place to talk about this monograph and this research than the home of the Ruth Finley Archive, the Ruth Finley Collection at Special Collections and College Archives at the Gladys Marcus Library at FIT. So In American Fashion was published in September 2024, and it really is the culmination of 10 years of research and work on the American Fashion Calendar published by Ruth Finley, as well as her publication, Fashion Calendar. The introduction lays out the theoretical and methodological framework for the study on the fashion calendar, its history, its long-term impact on the development and trajectory of the American fashion industry and market, and its value as a historical archive. The stories and histories revealed in this book expose the key force in the development of the organized American fashion system, its calendar and time system. Founded by Ruth Finley and sisters Frances and Alice Hughes in 1941, Fashion Calendar is a fascinating and poignant example of a simple, solution-oriented idea that contributed significantly to the development and culture of a national industry. This analysis integrates historical, sociological, and anthropological analyses of calendars and their role in creating and sustaining time systems. With my reading of the archive, I argue for the structural impact of the fashion calendar over the American fashion and creative industries in the US, and I demonstrate how the publication and its publisher helped establish and adapt a temporal architecture for a major national industry. So here I have some images of showing some photos of Ruth Finley. On the left, there's a photograph of Ruth Finley at her desk in 1945. The center photo is a photograph of Ruth Finley and Diane von Furstenberg Ruth Finley received the CFDA Board of Directors Award in the Board of Directors Tribute in 2014. And on the far right, the movie poster for a documentary that myself and a team worked on, really showcasing Ruth Finley during Fashion Week, and really talking about her experience running the fashion calendar for so many years. So the fashion calendar really was a serialized weekly publication, and it was published weekly until 1983. Thereafter, she started publishing it twice a month. And the Ruth Finley collection, now at Special Collections and College Archives, as well as the Calendar Archive, comprises of over 3,000 issues and amounts to upwards of 39,000 pages of material in a consistent text-based format. Listings in the calendar were submitted by subscribers or non-subscribers and were aimed at the press and internal industry and reflected the many adjacent American creative and manufacturing industries such as retailing, footwear, cosmetics, millinery, menswear, textiles, and more. What makes Fashion Calendar such a rich record of the American fashion and creative industries is that it has all of the sort of adjacent industries to fashion and all of the uh, materials necessary to produce fashion as well. The fashion calendar also included international fashion weeks and the calendars and trade events taking place around the world. And as the fashion industry became increasingly globalized in the late 20th century, it also reflected the ascendance of American fashion via Fashion Week. It also importantly included the social calendar and reflected the culture of the fashion and creative communities in the US and abroad. Finley's calendar took a democratic approach and did not operate as a gatekeeper to participation, but sought to accurately reflect the fashion schedule and significantly worked as a service to help subscribers clear dates uh, and avoid conflicting events during key market and presentation weeks. I argue that over time, fashion calendar itself became a visual representation of the centralized American fashion industry and took on the role as a symbol for time and participation within the field of fashion in New York and within the American fashion market. The Pink Bible, as it was known, and its longtime editor, Finley herself, embodied New York's accessible fashion market and its schedule, which led to the institutionalization of the publication as the official calendar of New York Fashion Week beginning in 1993. Importantly, this work considers how Fashion Calendar was used as an essential tool by designers, creators, and more to navigate the fashion and creative communities in New York and beyond. The publication was a means of communication and an entry point for participation in the American fashion market, and especially before the establishment of the Council of Fashion Designers of America and its transformation into the premier governing body of the American fashion industry, there were few institutions that unified the disparate groups that made up the creative and industrial arms of the American fashion industry. My analysis includes the content within the pages of the fashion calendar itself to elucidate the commercial spheres of public relations, fashion, politics, industry, and popular culture. The fashion calendar and Finley therefore played a key role in the professionalization of the industry and the articulation of its community as both a mediator and cultural intermediary within what Joanne Entwistle describes as the aesthetic economy of fashion. The fashion calendar helps expand our understanding of calendars and their role in setting temporal rhythms and cycles. The publication itself contributed significantly to the structuring of the American fashion industry, but its flexibility in reflecting the dynamism of the industry and its unique legacy of independence from any one group made it more than a calendar or trade publication. It was integral in the open and democratic nature of the American fashion market between 1941 and 2014. Chapter 1 explores the gaps between the existing oral narrative and the historical record about the publication's origins and development. Through archival research, Finley's personal collection, and public records, such as census data and immigration uh, records, I reconstructed a more detailed record of the history of the publication. The first chapter lays out how the creation and existence of the fashion calendar helps illuminate issues including identity, labor, gender, religion, capitalism, and American society in the 1930s through the 1950s. Ruth Finley was born Ruth Faith Finberg on January 14th, 1920, in Haverhill, Massachusetts. She was the third of four children born to Anna Finberg and Joseph B. Finberg. Finley's father arrived in the United States in 1903 alone as a young teenager. He immigrated from Vilno, now Vilnius, Lithuania, then part of the Russian Empire, likely due to increased anti-Jewish sentiment in the region and restrictions Jewish people faced living in the Pale of Settlement. Joseph Finberg worked as a jeweler and then studied dentistry in Boston and later settled down and opened his dental practice in the town of Haverhill. I was able to find this photograph of Dr. Joseph Finberg's dentist office in the Haverhill, Massachusetts Public Library, which had a collection of photographs that surveyed the streets of Haverhill, Massachusetts in the late 1920s. So Ruth Finley was born in 1920. She went to high school in Haverhill, and she claimed that it was during her college summers that she spent in New York City. She went to college in Boston at Simmons College, but during the summers, she went to New York City, and there she met Alice and Frances Hughes, the two career women she often spoke about and brought up when asked about the start of the fashion calendar. Although their casual meeting and conversation was said to have led to the conception of fashion calendar, the connections between the Hughes sisters and Finley went back further than that meeting, to the small Jewish immigrant communities of the industrial towns of the Northeast, where Finley and the Hughes sisters were from and which connected their families. So the Hughes sisters, we see on the left Alice Hughes, who was born in 1899, and on the right there's a photograph of Frances Hughes, born in 1906, were actually born Alice and Fanny Felsher. They hailed from Manchester, New Hampshire, where their father settled with his wife, Esther Felsher, and their children after immigrating from Vilno in 1900 to 1902. Louis Felsher owned a clothing store, and some of his older children worked in that store. And as described by Haja Diner, who is an expert on the history of Jewish labor and immigration in the early 20th century, Louis Felsher followed a common trajectory of new Eastern European Jewish immigrants to the United States, who at the turn of the century predominantly entered the garment business as tailors, peddlers, or in the case of Felsher, a shop owner and merchant. The industrial towns of the Northeast saw a rise in the establishment of Jewish communities at the turn of the century, and increased numbers of Jewish people fled anti-Semitism, pogroms, and economic disadvantages, and immigrated to the United States in search of economic opportunities. Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Manchester, New Hampshire are less than 40 miles apart, and the Jewish congregations of the two towns have historically overlapped. And both the towns, particularly Manchester, was known for having a predominantly Litvak Jewish community. When I spoke to Finley about how she met the Felsher sisters, she mentioned that her father was their dentist. And it was confirmed when I learned about the Jewish communities in the region and the Litvak connection between the Felshers and Joseph Finberg. Interestingly, Alice and Frances Hughes' trajectory from the industrial towns of New Hampshire to becoming noted women's pages and fashion editors in New York was similar to other children of immigrants during this period. Many were able to take on advanced educations and professional careers because their parents worked as merchants or in more traditionally immigrant dominated professions. Both Alice and Frances graduated from Columbia University, Alice graduated from the Pulitzer School of Journalism in 1921, and Frances earned a degree in English from Barnard in 1924. Interestingly, Alice had a very important career, particularly with a column called A Woman's New York. She also had a syndicated column with King's syndication, and both these women were a full generation older than Finley and very much took her under their wing. Interestingly, the way I was really able to find information on Alice and Frances Hughes was by finding the alumni registers from Columbia Universities, from Columbia University, because it actually listed their maiden names along with their married names and their professional names, which was hard to piece together, particularly as I'll talk about all three women, Ruth, Frances, and uh, Alice, all used professional names and changed their last names. After journalism school, Alice Hughes went into one of the only journalistic avenues open to women, which was fashion, and first worked as a copywriter for Macy's. She had a very interesting career where she was later at the New York Post and at the New York Telegram. She also, with then First Lady of New York State, Eleanor Roosevelt, were part of the charter group of members of establishing Fashion Group International, a trade organization and labor organization for women working in the fashion business and press. And by the early 30s, she had traveled extensively around the world on assignment for the New York Telegram and reported on fashion and the lives of women in China, Turkey, and the USSR. She even managed to interview Leon Trotsky on a Turkish island and reported back in an article called Alice in Russia Land. Frances, also known as Francie, upon graduation, interned at Macy's, and then she later became a PR or a fashion publicity director for A.S. Speck Shoes and Company. She, like her sister, became active in the fashion group and was appointed a specials projects editor at Mademoiselle in 1943. So, as we know, in 1939, as we have the beginnings, as Britain and France enter World War II, uh, we see a major shift happening in the American fashion, focused on uh, focused on continuing the fashion information and styles and design coming from France. France at the time was still understood as the leader in driving fashion design. And with the increased growth of the industry in the 30s and 40s, there were concerted attempts on the American side at setting a structure and creating a system for the American industry. In the previous, which late in the previous century transitioned to hand to machine made cottage industry to national industry, and was amplified by the ever potent and circulated daily, weekly, and monthly national press. Um, American manufacturers and press reproduced designs coming from the couture runways for the American market or licensed models directly from French companies. When Great Britain and France entered the Second World War in 1939, fashion information dispatched from Europe virtually came to a halt. With the occupation of Paris in the early summer of 1940, most of the haute couture houses were temporarily shut down. American manufacturers were presented with the need to design their own collections. And so what I found was that in September 1940, a lot of the American department stores and companies held fashion shows dedicated to showing their new collections for the following season. And I found this really interesting this article in the Women's Wear Daily archive from October of 1940 that was titled Fashion Writers Recommend Plan for Press Showings. And this article was really an open letter directed at the retail executives, describing exactly what was needed by the fashion press, which ran on its own schedule, based off of printing schedules, um, demanding specific sort of upgrades to how they were running Fashion Week at the time. As you could see here, timing the fashion shows within the working day, making requesting announcements in advance, starting the shows on time, which is something that still today is asked for, and and essentially describing to the fashion executives the needs journalists need in order to be able to effectively communicate the new designs or the interesting fashion to the reader. And this article was signed by 10 of the most important journalists, particularly newspaper journalists of the era. And I have it here on the bottom part of the screen. And of course, Alice Hughes, who is representing, I believe, the New York Post, is one of the signatories. And so what we know is that shortly after this, in early 1941, we have the establishment of the fashion calendar, which I really argue is a response to the early disorganized fashion shows that took place in September 1940 as a result of the beginning of the Nazi occupation of Paris. And so the establishment of the fashion calendar and the histories behind the three women involved in it, I think also demonstrate a very interesting narrative that I was able to untangle, which really showed and demonstrated how told and untold stories that are being showcased were emblematic of broader histories of the United States during the first half of the 20th century. The political atmosphere of the Second World War era, which was heavily nationalistic, anti Semitic, and patriarchal, was certainly a challenging environment for female business owners as they navigated the nascent industry. As you may have noticed, Ruth, Alice, and Frances all changed their last names and or went by their professional names. And like so many other Americans, um, during that period, many people changed their names, particularly in the early 1940s, as a reaction to the broader political and wartime sentiment. Evidently, the Hughes sisters and Finley distanced themselves from their Jewish and Russian laid back immigrant identities by using professional names with little trace of their true origins. After all, Alice Hughes was born in Vilna and immigrated to the US as a child. Um, and when I looked at all of the census data, it was very interesting how over the decades, information about their immigrant past became less and less apparent within the census. And by the 1930 census, Alice Hughes claimed that she was born in Manchester, New Hampshire, and so were her parents. Um, The Finberg family faced similar circumstances, which were retold by Finley when asked about her last name. Finley's older brother was the first to change his family name and choose Finbury with the idea that it would help him overcome the anti Jewish sentiment in the military and be admitted to the US Navy. Finley adopted Finbury as her name, and as soon as she graduated in 1941, she then later adopted Finley because she was told that a shorter name would be better for her work that was mainly conducted over the telephone at the fashion calendar. So whether for professional, personal security or driven by generational trauma, the three women changed their names and identities to assimilate into broader American society. And this is very much in line with the research and work discussed by Kristen Firmaglick in her fascinating study about the history of Jewish name changing in the United States. Her study looked at court records from 1940 to 1942, and particularly in 1942, she found an 800% increase in the request for name changes, and 66% of those were to change from a Jewish sounding last name. And what I find so interesting in this research about the background of the three women and how it came to develop, how they came to develop fashion calendars, that they also used all of these different tactics to essentially claim authority and the ability to run this business in a time when women were generally excluded from these uh, systems. Um, Chapter 2 traces the history of the seasonal fashion presentations in New York from retail and department stores to Eleanor Lambert's Press Week, which she established in 1943, and the model it created for the centralized fashion market and for the weeks to come. Once it was established that the American fashion industry was going to hold its own fashion weeks and present its own designs, Eleanor Lambert was hired by the New York Dress Institute to help create publicity for the American manufacturers. She has helped establish Press Week, which was the first centralized New York Fashion Week that often was held at a hotel. And we could see here the fashion calendar listing for the New York Dress Institute's inaugural Press Week, and a listing of all the different companies who are participating and how people could attend. I think this also really demonstrates really well the really granular, important types of information that the fashion calendar included, including, you know, the date, the time, who was giving it, and then information from the press release. Through a reading of listings and fashion calendar, the trade discourse surrounding the schedule and market weeks, the characteristic tensions between the industrial and creative sides of the industry are revealed. The calendar made it an important tool. The calendar the calendar's accessibility made it an important tool for the participation of designers and companies, and as a result, it recorded the majority of those who participated in any fashion season year round. An emphasis on labor and the role of trade associations in groups in setting the market dates reveal how the networks of power and influence have helped shape the American fashion industry today. Through the calendar listings, I was able to really trace the development and trajectory of the fashion presentations and the market week in New York City, and how it really reflected the positionality of the American market within a broader global market at any given time. And chapter 2 really looks at how the fashion calendar became emblematic and uh, central to the development of New York Fashion Week in 1993. On the left, we have the first New York Fashion Week grid, which was published along with all the other listings and fashion calendar. And on the right, a photograph of the first New York Fashion Week tent set up at Bryant Park, which was centralized, which centralized the Council of Fashion Designers of America, who centralized Fashion Week at Bryant Park. Really worked in collaboration with Ruth, since the fashion calendar and its legacy in structuring the American industry continued, even though CFDA was really helping organize Fashion Week. So the publication really worked as a clearinghouse for dates and times, and was the publication of record for setting the American fashion market dates, which renewed the capitalist cycle of fashion and garment retailing seasonally. It was also used by many different sectors of the garment and fashion industries. Further, this chapter really scrutinizes the time slot, the essential unit of the calendar format, which continues to represent a hallmark of participation, and created a chronopolitics within the schedule itself, whereby the designated time slot included broader commercial implications for the success of a collection's release. With the globalization of the international fashion show circuit in the 1990s, the implications surrounding one's position within the American market also became important in relation into the broader global fashion system. I also talk about how the fashion calendar was also instrumental in helping shift the uh, the the order of the fashion month, and the important shift and impact to New York City of the movement of New York Fashion Week from the end of the Fashion Week calendar, essentially after all of the major fashion months, like major fashion weeks, including London, Milan, and Paris. It was originally scheduled at the end of that fashion month, and it is now at the beginning. And that shift in 1998, I believe, it really impacted, continues to impact not only the calendar, but the industry itself. Chapter 3 really looks at the social calendar and how the fashion show and fashion culture were reproduced for philanthropy, diplomacy, and politics. Through a reading of the types of causes and events that appeared in the fashion calendar, the imagined community that it helped articulate united over more than the common drive for profitability and commercial success. The fashion community came together to support shared social, nationalistic, and patriotic causes, particularly during wartime. The social causes supported by the fashion community reflected the demographics of its labor force, and many different causes like the March of Dimes event, which fundraised for polio, and the National Jewish Hospital in Denver were prominent causes supported by key players and organizations. During the 1980s and 1990s, the fashion and creative communities were crushed by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and it became a unifying force and primary cause for benefits and fundraisers. So, chapter 3 really looks at how calendars themselves have been analyzed by historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and theorists alike, and how calendars are included in the MIT Encyclopedia of Cognitive Sciences as a cognitive artifact, which supports not only memory but also reasoning about classification and comparison. The effects calendars and on understandings of temporality, community, and religious rituals have been studied by Kevin Berth, and Kevin Berth's um, work on expansion of Benedict Arnold's work on imagined communities through calendars is really the basis of what I look at, the basis of the ideas of what I look at in this chapter. We could see from this page, not only is the commercial calendar listings related to Fashion Week and the American fashion sort of retail cycle and manufacturing cycle present, but you could also see listings for Holy Week, Palm Sunday, as well as Passover, and the integration of the religious and communitarian calendars of the communities and demographics who make up the majority of the labor of the fashion industry, I think make Fashion Calendar a very dynamic, interesting resource that combines a multitude of time systems that really reflects its community. The capitalist drive to cannibalize holidays and rituals into marketing opportunities meant that industries latched on to particular dates or cycles for the year. That is the floral industry and Mother's Day. And there are scholars who assert that American celebrations were to help mark out a rhythm of sales events. Conversely, Fashion Calendar latched onto the growing fashion and creative industries and really helped sustain this socially constructed calendar that ultimately operates 6 months in advance to the Gregorian calendar. Sociologist Eviatar Zerubbabel's exploration into calendars and schedules reveals the connections between schedules and social solidarity and the boundaries which distinguish and separate group members from outsiders also serve to solidify in-group sentiments. The fashion communities that made up the American garment industry, which until it was offshored in the 1980s was the largest manufacturing industry in New York. It operated on its own time system and calendar and which was constructed 6 months in the future. And this polyrhythmic structure was reinforced since along with the fashion seasons, as I said, we have all the religious and communal calendars as well. The time system, or what Zerubbabel describes as the socio-temporal structure that the semi-annual and later even quarterly commercial cycles formed, temporal links which are closely related to group formation. Therefore, the time system and imagined community that fashion calendar helped structure reflected the demographics of its culture and really helped form this community, which I then argue also create used fashion culture, such as fashion shows or sales, like retail sales, to fundraise for causes that were important to people in the industry and members of the industry. Chapter 4 explores the aftermath of the sale of the fashion calendar, particularly in the early 2010s. We see a huge increase in the amount of companies participating in Fashion Week, especially once Fashion Week was decentralized and no longer in Bryant Park. As fashion shows were all over the city, we see more and more companies participating and brands participating. And as a result, the fashion calendar really became a behemoth. And in 2014, the Council of Fashion Designers of America acquired the right to schedule New York Fashion Week from Ruth and took over publication of the fashion calendar. So this chapter really looks at the end of the independent arbiter, how that impacted New York Fashion Week, but also looks at how COVID and the disruption of the global fashion industrial system that occurred as a result of the emergency sort of stopping of really everything going on, impacted the fashion industry and the discussions and discourse around the calendar and its association with the ever increased speed of production, as well as the ever increased impact on the environment that the fashion industry uh, continues to participate in. Chapter 5 is dedicated to a discussion of the fashion calendar's second act, which was digitizing the Ruth Finley collection. A few years ago, Karen Trevette, who is the former head of special collections, and I collaborated on, and we were able to get a grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and we got a grant to digitize the entire calendar archive, and more than just digitize the archive and make all of the pages viewable online, open source to the public. We really wanted to make all of the incredible amount of data in the fashion calendar searchable and more dynamic to the users, especially now with so much work being done in digital humanities and online. There's a growing body of literature about data and data analytics in humanities, and um, building on research such as data feminism and queer data. We really wanted to see how we could get more sort of humanities related information from all of this. So the first step was really extracting all of the data from the fashion calendars, which after a lot of challenging sort of delays, we were able to find an AI company based in Canada that helped us develop a tool to extract and parse all of the information within the calendars, which you could see here. We then had list of almost 8,000 names of companies and designers who have listed in Fashion Calendar over the 7 decades. And then we had many FIT interns and students do primary source research and add identity attributions to all of the names and people listed in the calendar. And so the database allows for large scale, like longitudinal searches that allows for looking at patterns over time, but also looking at participation of different groups over time, and allows for data visualization to create charts and graphs and maps, etc. We sought out to transform the archive into a more complex digital humanities project that aimed to apply digital tools to quantify the information in the publication and expand accessibility and discoverability of marginalized and traditionally underrepresented groups and their participation over time within the fashion and creative industries. To realize these goals, data within the calendars, the who, what, when, and how, as well as descriptive information needed to be extracted and parsed, and all of that additional identity information was um, very much informed by, and the approaches were informed by concepts of critical cataloging as well, discussed by Emily Dobrinsky. And so the fashion calendar database and and the quantitative research possibilities were crucial in the writing and research of An American Fashion. Being able to go through all of the listings and really understand larger patterns over time was crucial in not only understanding uh, different elements of the history of American fashion, but also the value and importance of the publication, and its force within establishing this time system over 7 decades. Here I have a QR code that just brings you, oh, the QR code might be to purchase the book, and a link to the fashion calendar database, which is completely open source and available to anyone, anywhere. Um, and so I think this brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for everyone thank you so much to everyone for joining, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Natalie. That was really great. I'm really excited about your your book. I've started reading it. Um, there is one question in the chat, and as I said earlier, if anyone has questions, please drop them in the chat, and I will relay them to Natalie. But let's start with this one from Giselle. Do you see the loss of the independent fashion calendar as a loss of democracy or democratic process in terms of the fashion industry?
So, in my experience, I think that I've heard different things from different elements of the industry. A lot of people who are participating and who had been in the fashion industry and listing with Ruth in the late 90s and early 2000s definitely understood and experienced the chaos of the really huge and very quick expansion of not only the fashion market, but how Fashion Week itself not only became extremely mediatized, but extremely difficult to navigate as the amount of shows increased. Um, and so the CFDA, part of their desire to take over the calendar was not only to run Fashion Week in a similar fashion as the European counterparts, but also as a way of streamlining and really making navigate Fashion Week simpler and easier for its constituents, which are the press, which are the buyers, which are really the people who are communicating the new collections to the public. And so I think, but then again, you have new and emerging designers who may not have companies that are that earn enough or at the level of being able to get through and get access to listing in the fashion calendar. And so I think it's an interesting, I think the fact that there's a gatekeeper now makes it so that participation is more difficult, and as a result, less democratic. But a lot of those shows and a lot of those brands who are showing are still showing. Being on the CFDA calendar is very much a symbol of participation and sort of acceptance into the American fashion um, sort of creative industry of that season. But I think that there's also a lot happening off the calendar. And what I argue in American fashion is that ultimately I see this as a maturation of the American fashion system, which, for so many, and the American fashion market, which for so many decades had been really ad hoc and unlike any other um, market week, which on one side made it very open and easy to access, but then also very chaotic and unruly. You're welcome, Giselle. Oh, Samantha, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Um, I have a question for you. Um, this this book is one aspect of a very large project that you have been working on for many years. We have the fashion calendar database, but there's also a documentary. So I'm wondering if you can tell me how this book is supplementing the documentary and the fashion calendar and other projects that you are doing with this collection.
Unlike some of my other work, really is focused on an in-depth scholarly uh, analysis of the publication in a broader sense. And it really is the first scholarly monograph dedicated to fashion calendars and the fashion calendar in any city. Um, I think, the Calendar Girl, excuse me, which was the documentary I wrote and produced about fashion, about Ruth Finley, was a fabulous portrait of Ruth. We spent time with her. In her own words, she gets to describe her experience and her whole her whole career and her legacy. And I think it really shares with the audience a really fantastic and really true portrayal of who she was and her incredible verve for life and experience of being a single mother and owning a business for 7 decades and running it out of her apartment, but also simultaneously uh, really fundamentally impacting a major billion-dollar industry is a really amazing story. And the fashion and the documentary Calendar Girl really focuses on that personal portrait. The database was a great way not only to help me do my work for this book, but was an amazing way to share all of this incredible amount of knowledge with the public. When Ruth Finley donated her archive to FIT, sharing it with students and the public was her primary goal. And I think the database really shares her legacy and expands her legacy even further. And the In American Fashion is really my perspective and interpretation of the archive, of primary sources, and of the publication more broadly in a scholarly and academic way through the lenses of history. So the book has footnotes and citations and a bibliography, and it's my contribution to understanding its role and impact in the industry and creative industries more broadly.
Cool, thank you. We have a couple of questions from Keely. Did Ruth Finley operate more behind the scenes, or was she a more public-facing individual? And also, what would you say is the hardest part about the undertaking and starting of a large digital humanities project?
Great questions. I think in if you worked in the American fashion industry on the PR side or on the sort of event fashion market side, or even were a designer, you knew who Ruth was. She was very much known in her field, especially since she had done it for so many years, and she was really the only person who did it in New York for so many decades. She was really known as the person who ran the fashion calendar. But interestingly, because, her publication was not published to the wider public, or wasn't even relevant for the wider public because it was really trade oriented, she wouldn't have been known to the wider public. So I think in the fashion industry, she was really well known. Um, and I still meet people all the time who come up to me and say how much they miss Ruth and how much they miss the fashion calendar, particularly people who work in PR who may have been looking at the fashion calendar for fashion events, but also all kinds of other PR events. And so, in many ways, the end of Ruth Finley's fashion calendar is a loss for many different industries, because it provided a service for more than just the fashion industry. And then your second question, the challenge or what it takes to undertake such a large digital humanities project. Well, first of all, I have to thank Joseph Anderson, digital lead and developer here at FIT, who really built it all out. But it really just takes a lot of dedication and being relentless, because we had, even in the development of the project, we hit a lot of hiccups, and in the fundraising for the project, which took many different tries and dedication, and really understanding what the best type of application was in order to get funding. And then also, of course, wading through all the challenges that occur when creating these these types of projects. It's really just, determination to get it done. And then also, if people tell you, oh, that's impossible, and oh, or we can't do that, my best advice is to just continue trying, because you'll find someone who will help you do it.
Thanks, Natalie. So we have a few more minutes, and I'm wondering if you wanted to give us a showing of the database.
Sure, I'll do that. I'll share my screen again. So, for those of you who are still on, the Fashion Calendar database is available on fashioncalendar.fit.nyc.edu. It is completely open source and available to the public. And you can go and look through every issue of Fashion Calendar as if you are in special collections, and flip through on a page viewer where you can really flip through every single page. So this is from January 1963, and go and approach the calendars by date, etc. You could then go and search uh, different terms by keyword search, which will help you, find the keywords in the document. But what's really interesting in what we did was that you could also then turn it into data, right? So each listing will then represent a listing in Fashion Calendar, and associated the names of the people who listed will then have descriptions and sources associated with them, and all kinds of different tools related to data visualization. So, well, this was looking at events per year. It's only one calendar. Sorry. If we go into the map, all of the locations and dates were geocoded. So you could then go and look at the trajectory of uh, locations and spaces where events occurred. And you could also refine by name, category, etc. You could then also just search in the data as a whole, and either look through an advanced search by using a combination of full text or different names and categories, and all of the names that appear in Fashion Calendar in this name list index, which you could then search, or you could then look in the categories. So if you're looking at, not only regions, places, categories of clothing like footwear or formal wear, but also identity categories such as women, African American, BIPOC, LGBTQIA, you could really look at and mix and match all these terms, and look at different people and marginalized communities that, or not necessarily marginalized communities, but people, elements of questions, elements of culture and impact that are generally hidden from these type of text-based archives. If you see some Patrick Kelly's name here, if you don't know that he's an African American designer who died of AIDS, unfortunately, in I think 1990, I believe, it would be hard to really know that he made in really important strides for African American designers, particularly in Paris, etc. So having all this identity attributions and information helps users really understand the data in more sort of complex ways. And there are many other sort of ways of looking at the database and the data in the calendar. There's almost 300,000 listings. So I encourage you to navigate it and play around with it and be in touch with us if you have any questions or suggestions, or to just share how you've used it.
So thank you so much. If there are no more questions, thank you, Natalie, for your great presentation of this new book that you have out. It's up in the library and online. So for more information on FIT authors or how to submit to be featured, go to the website at authors.fitnyc.edu. You can also follow us on Instagram for info on upcoming FIT authors talks at FIT NYC Library. Thank you for joining us and have an amazing evening.